Good day Thursday to everyone, and it's good to be back again as we dive into the Gospel of Matthew again. In fact, today I want to look at, give me a moment here, Matthew 5:21 through, we're going to go through 37. I think that's about as far as we'll be able to get to today. I'd be stretching it. I only want to do about 15 or 20 minutes, so 5:21 through 37. So if you would, go ahead and read that. And then after you've read it, come back and I'll start my discussion on it. So go ahead and pause it here and go ahead and read Matthew 5:21 through 37. Now, I'm supposing that you have read, so let me just begin talking about a few things here before we get started. Now, there's a phrase that's repeated 6 times in this discourse, and it's going to continue on through the section we look at next week too, all the way down to verse 48. But Jesus keeps saying, you have heard it said about something, and then he says, but I tell you. So what's going on is that the way that the Jewish people have understood the Old Covenant, and we can see this beginning with John the Baptist ministry, that they have they've added things to the text, they've incorporated things into the text that have made the text very, very more expansive, I guess, and they've drifted away from the pure intent. So Jesus is really trying to get them to come back to the pure intent of some of these commands. So we are dealing with Old Covenant stuff still here. However, many of these principles carry over into the New Testament also. But just remember that Jesus is teaching out of the Old Covenant, and he's moving to the New Covenant. We haven't got there yet, so some of this stuff could be applicable, and most of it is. Definitely, and we'll get started. I'll be bringing that out, pointing that out as we go. Another thing is that you notice that the word hell shows up in here. I think it's a couple times. The word actually there, and if you have a good modern translation, it'll have some kind of a notation right behind the word hell. It'll give you a number or a letter notification, and if you look down into the bottom of the page or to the side notes, it'll say something effective. In the Greek, it's Gehenna, which it is. It's Gehenna. Gehenna is an Aramaic word that means Valley of Hinnom, or the Valley of Hinnom is what we know, and it's a place that's outside of Jerusalem. This was a place that King Josiah, 600 years earlier, desecrated because they were sacrificing children on it to Molech. So Josiah desecrated this place, and it became a trash heap. And this is a place where there was constant fires burning, and people would take all kinds of trash out there to this place. And so when we get to this part, I don't know why they translated it as hell, but it is Gehenna. But you notice it often says the hell of fire or the Gehenna of fire, meaning that there's fire in this place. It's just a trash heap, a place where people dump stuff. And we'll get to that just in a second. Now, another thing, Jesus will often use exaggeration or hyperbole throughout this discourse of teaching. So the reason why you use exaggeration is to press your point even further. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that the person wants you to go to this extent of observing this restraint or instruction or whatever it is, but they want you to understand that what they're discussing is very, very serious, and that you should have the mentality that you're willing to go to this point, even though that's not what it's called for. Jesus is exaggerating. This is another area where we have the short, choppy instructions, so things move very, very quickly. Okay, this first section about anger carries us through 5:21 through 26. This is about judgment, about murder. He says basically if you murder someone, you will be liable to judgment. And then he goes on and talks about the person who's angry with his brother. They'll also be liable to judgment. The phrase liable to judgment, or he will be liable to judgment, is the same phrase used twice. And I bring this up because Jesus is associating the act of murder with the act of hate. Now you might scratch your head and think like, well, murder is so much more severe than hate. Well, we're going to see this in the next part too, but what Jesus is really trying to get at is that we have got to control that root problem, the beginning point. Hate is the beginning of murder. And so if you begin with that, then it's likely to go on to that point, okay? And so we've got to stem anger at its very beginning. Now, anger itself is not a sin. However, anger is not an emotion that you should linger in very long at all. In fact, it should be a warning sign to you that if I continue in this emotional state, I will probably do something very foolish. And that's usually what happens. So you want to get rid of anger. In fact, Paul says in Ephesians 4, he says, let your anger be gone before the sun goes down, that kind of idea. So get rid of it. It's just not a good mentality to be in. But again, Jesus is getting to the root. So if you never hated someone, you would never murder someone. Murder always begins with hate. They'll be liable to judgment. Now, here's another area where I know it's talking about the Old Covenant and pointing to some areas that's really concerning for Jewish people. And it's the word council in verse 22. The word is actually Sanhedrin. And so I don't know why they don't translate it that way. But he's talking about their day-to-day lives. If they did something wrong, they would be taken before the Sanhedrin, and there would be some kind of a trial or something going on, and they would be given punishment or acquitted or something to that effect. But again, the point is that get rid of the problem at its beginning point, at the nexus point. Get rid of this stuff. He goes on, and he talks about reconciliation, leaving your gift at the altar. Go reconcile your relationship with your whoever before you give your gift at the altar, which is really interesting because we would probably think like, well, my gift is more important. My gift to God is more important than this. But Jesus says, no, you need to reconcile your relationship before you ever give your gift at the altar. And this is another thing that comes back in the idea of communion later on in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Paul says basically, if you're having problems with your brothers and sisters in the church for some reason, something's going on, you better get your attitude right with them before you take communion. You better examine yourself. Are you maybe dishonoring other people, not sharing? Those are the kind of things that's going on in 1 Corinthians 11. But again, this is very important. Our relationships with one another. Now, this is between covenant members. We're not talking about outside the covenant. We're talking about instructions for covenant members. So in the covenant, these kind of things should be going on. So if you have some kind of a problem with your brother, and I know the reason, why it's covenant is because of the term brother. This is language that's, is covenantal community language. And so if you have a problem, then go get that thing straightened out. And then he even goes further to an accuser. An accuser would be someone who you probably would consider to be your enemy in a lot of respects. And later on, he's going to talk about loving your enemies. But again, it's not about trying to prove your innocence or something. Maybe this person's suing you and you're trying to fight against it. Basically, Jesus says, go and reconcile this stuff before it gets worse. So the idea is that, again, is to take care of the problem at its beginning point, when it's not very dangerous, when it's not grown into some kind of impulse that you can't control anymore. Take care of these problems early on. This is the key. And our relationships with one another, it's very, very important to God in our covenant, and it carries over into the new covenant too. These kind of instructions about treating one another well within the church, other Christians, this is the way we're supposed to behave. So this is instruction that carries over very easily into other new covenant areas. Lust. Next section, Matthew 5:27 through 30, is about lust, about committing adultery. And so, if you notice, you look through here, it never says anything giving instructions to the woman. It's only instructions to the man. Why would that be? What I'm getting ready to say, a lot of ladies are going to find offensive. Not because I don't think this way. I don't believe this way at all. But this is the way it was at that time of history, that era. Women were treated as property. Now, that's not right. I know it's not right. God didn't want it that way. Jesus didn't want it that way. But this is the way people live just because of their sin that's infested their lives. They treat others poorly, and women are physically weaker than men, so men tend to abuse. That's the kind of idea that's going on here. So women they just weren't thought of highly at that time, sadly. And truthfully, a neat study if you guys, for the ladies, is start to understand how Jesus starts to lift up the social status of women, how the Apostle Paul lifts up the social status of women beyond that of the standing of their day. But anyway, so women were considered property. They just weren't treated very well. And so a man, if he had some desire for another woman or something, This could lead to adultery, and again, it's this idea of catch the problem at its beginning point. At that initial impulse or whatever's going on, that initial thought, that's when you've got to nip this problem right there to get rid of it in your life. And so don't let it flourish. Don't let it go on. So if you have these ideas about women, then you need to stop, is what it is. Now, another thing about this that's so sad is that men do not generally look at women as a colleague, capable of doing certain things. They tend to brush them aside and have more of a sexist type of view towards women, which is not good. Men should not think that way about women. And so we've got to understand that we need to honor them also, respect them, and treat them like a person and not like an object. And that's what you do when you lust after something. You treat it like an object. Well, that's not the way that we're supposed to think about women. Now, Jesus exaggerates here. This point is complete exaggeration. If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it somewhere, because it'd be better for you to lose that than to be thrown into this place of this trash, this dump, basically, of unwanted materials. Okay, now he's using it as a metaphor. So whatever happens after a person dies, it's an unwanted place. So Gehenna is representative of an unwanted place in this world, and what happens next is another unwanted place. And I think probably Revelation describes it the best, the lake of burning sulfur. So that's where I stick with. But anyway, it's exaggeration. It's like, get these problems taken care of early, when they're easy to overcome, when they're at their weakest, as far as enticing you to do what you should not do. And again, Jesus isn't asking us to tear out our eyes and cut off a hand. And I think people have done these kind of things before just because they were trying to follow the Bible, as literal instruction. Well, this is a time when you need to be careful and understand how he's using this information. He's exaggerating to make a point. And the point is this, is that don't let these small impulses grow into sinful desires that you no longer can control. Get them taken care of at an early beginning. Then he goes on and he talks about divorce. Now again, remember, women are thought of as property. Okay? That's not good. I'm not saying that. I don't condone it. In fact, I'm firmly against it. But this is where they're at this point. Now, divorce itself is an ugly practice. Okay? It's ugly. Let's not sugarcoat it. It's ugly, and it's very unfortunate that this is occurring in many Christian, it happens a lot in Christian communities. And I've seen the stats, and I've heard people talk about it, that divorce in the church is slightly higher than divorce in the secular world. Okay, it's bad enough that we have few divorces in the church, but this statistic is definitely misleading, and I want to tell you why. There are many cases I know where a person they marry each other as non-Christians, and then one of the persons becomes a Christian, and the non-Christian cannot stand to live with the person who's a Christian anymore, and they might cause a divorce. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if that happens, these things happen. Now, I'm not saying the Christian wanted the divorce, but I'm saying that it takes two to stay committed. And so if one person walks away from that commitment, then that marriage is dissolved. So there could be divorces in the church that are accounted for reasons that a conversion reason, or maybe a person mistakenly married a non-Christian. And I would always advise any Christian, marry a Christian. But maybe a Christian married a non-Christian that causes problems later. Divorces happen, and the statistics that they have for church members, I don't think take into account all these other variables that we ought to consider when we're thinking about this. Now, again, to talk about divorce even being on the same percentage as secular divorce in the secular world is bad enough. But to talk about it at all really is bad. It's unfortunate. And church really needs to do a better job about teaching about the sanctity of marriage and the commitment to marriage itself. And we're just not doing a very good job. And until we get the divorce situation straightened out, I think we probably need to concentrate on that before we really get too carried away in other areas. But getting back to this. Why is there some kind of a directive about this divorce? And again, it's to men. Why is it to men and not to women? Again, females could not divorce their husbands. Wives could not divorce their husbands because they were not thought of as the same level of societal status. They were thought of as lesser. They were thought of as property to a large degree. Now, the reason why Jesus gives this instruction, it's going to come back in Matthew 19 again. It's going to come up twice in Matthew. Is that he's really trying to protect women. Now, I know a lot of people in the modern world, they go to this passage and they want to find out, well, what is the one reason I can use to divorce my spouse? And they say, well, on sexual immorality. And so they use that, well, there was some kind of sexual immorality in a marriage, which would be horrible. I'm not condoning that either. That would be horrible. And so, but they try to look for the reason why they can get a divorce instead of looking at this as what it was truly meant to be, which is a protection for ladies. Now, Jesus is teaching about a passage from Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. And what's going on here is that there are two schools of thought. If you have a study Bible, it'll probably bring this up at the very bottom in the notes. There were two rabbis. One was named Hillel, one was named Shammai. Shammai had a view of Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. Again, this is the passage about in the Old Covenant about divorcing a wife. He had the view from Deuteronomy 24 that a man could divorce their wife for any kind of unpleasant action that they've seen coming from that woman. I mean, it could be something as trivial as maybe the person doesn't think she's as beautiful anymore. Shammai basically gave men the complete allowance to divorce their wives. Hillel, on the other hand, took the other approach. And he said, no, there is no reason for you to divorce your wife except on the grounds of sexual immorality. Okay, and so we have two very opposing thoughts here. Jesus follows the teachings of Hillel. Not that he ever studied with Hillel, but this is what he's following. Now again, this is protection for females. Why? Okay, for a female to survive in that time, they had to have a husband to a large degree. And it wasn't hard for ladies to have husbands. Ladies at that time, there were probably maybe as much as twice as many men as there were women, because, and this is not a good statistic, so please don't think I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to explain why there were so many more men. Many, many women died during childbirth. Lots and lots. We forget this, but childbirth is dangerous. And many, many women died during childbirth. So there weren't as many women as there were men. Now, a woman had to have a husband. Now, it would have been hard to have a husband because there were so many more men. But a woman had to have a husband because she had no way to provide for herself. Not that she's weak or anything like that, but the females were not given land portions. They were not given an inheritance for the father's household unless they were the only children. And if they married before that happened, it probably went to the son-in-law. So they just weren't treated very well. And so Jesus is bringing this back in order to protect them. They have to have access through a husband to land so that they can grow things. So basically back then, everybody lived in a small village, and people had their portions of land outside the village. You lived in the village for safety. Everybody grouped together. You didn't live out on your own like we do today. And the people would leave their villages and they would go out and they'd work their land, grow their crops, maybe tend to their animals or whatever it is that they needed to do. You had to have a piece of land, and the land always went down from male to male to male. So a female that had no association with a male would not have any access to land, to have food, to live. And so this is a protection. Now, I don't think a woman's probably going to have sexual immorality at that time. And I think Jesus is basically saying you don't really ever get a divorce. Because this probably would have been very, very rare for a woman to engage in sexual immorality at that time. Seriously. So he's really trying to get them away from the view of Shammai, who basically said you can get a divorce for just anything, which was a terrible abuse against women. But if you do, going back to Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4, if there is a divorce, you have got to give her a certificate. Okay, a certificate. That says that she has been released from this other man and she is free to be married again and not She would not be committing adultery. If you don't have that certificate, though, then you cannot marry again. And if you do marry, it's committing adultery again. So what would happen back in those days is that a man might get tired of a lady, his wife, and put her out. That's exactly the words they used, put her out, and bring another female in. And sometimes this got so severe that they wouldn't even take care of those people, or they might just divorce this lady and she wouldn't have any way of taking care of herself. And so Jesus is really trying to stop this horrible practice to begin with. And the second thing, he's trying to protect females so that they have some access to food, some access to shelter, some access to some livelihood. All right, Os 33 through 37. It's pretty straightforward. In fact, it's just be honest people. I mean, that's what it is. Just be honest people. Now, he talks about like degrees of swearing. Like if you swear, he starts off with, you swear by heaven, or by earth, or by the great city, or by the great king, and the city of the great king, all these things he's talking about. If you swear by certain items, it elevates the requirement for them to fulfill that obligation. Let's put it that way. And so I guess it means like if you have a lesser meaningful object to swear to, that you didn't have to keep your word to a high degree. It just seems silly to me, but this is the way that they operated. And Jesus basically says, just be honest people. Don't make degrees of truthfulness. Be truthful people. And just let your yes be yes and your no be no. These are things you can control. You can control honesty. So we need to do that. All right, I'm going to stop right there. It's been good being with you today. I hope you found this to be helpful and meaningful. And next week we'll pick up where we left off. And I will see you on Sunday. And don't forget, we have our gospel concert this Sunday night. And it'll be a great time. And I hope you're inviting friends and family. We'll see you then. Bye.